topic of today is for sure a topic of great interest. We have the right person to guide us through the current situation. Roger Abächerli is as a background an electrical engineer. He studied in one of the most honored university in Switzerland, the EPFL. And he had a successful career in the industry and decided then, where he worked as a specialist in high-end signal processing. And after his industry career, he decided to come back to research and development, where he's now leading one research unit at the Institute for Medical Engineering at the Lucerne University of Applied Science and Art. During his activity, he has been awarded by several prizes, for example, the Jos Willems Award, the Biosignal Awards, the CTI Swiss medtech Award, just to mention few of them. I think Roger is for sure the right person to guide us through this complex topic and to help us understanding one of the key points in the background of developing AI solution for diagnostic imaging. Thank you very much, Roger.
Thank you, Christina, and a very warm welcome from my side to this seminar. The seminar will be a little bit different than the seminars you have already experienced beforehand. We will go less technology, a little bit more like law, rules, policy, regulation. So the whole topic of compliance is now key for this kind of seminar. And how to say, to answer the question already from the beginning, how do we cope with this regulatory environment? The answer is by good compliance. So the question is, how do we reach that good compliance? So let me first give a little bit an analysis of the situation. So meaning that a startup or an SME, even big companies want or even need to sell products to generate revenues. So this is given. This means that one has to sell the medtech product, even if that includes ML or AI. Now the problem is that one is not allowed to place a medtech product onto the market in Switzerland or European Union without following certain rules. So there are restrictions to that. This is part, as is called, regulatory affairs that each medtech company actually has to do. On the other hand, a software or the medical device that is developed at an academic or hospital site, so-called in-house product, cannot be used as such either. Certain rules do apply there too. A lot of people are not aware of that, unfortunately. So how is the medtech market? The medtech market has changed a lot in a lot of areas in the last years. Among other things, the requirements for the regulation have increased significantly. The so-called legal manufacturer and the R&D, so the research and development department, have received much more attention by the regulators. The quality management system and the regulatory affairs units have grown. So something like 10, 15 years ago, you had in a SME company of a standard size Swiss company, maybe 2-3 people working on quality management and regulatory affairs. Nowadays, these are 25 people doing the same job. So this gives already a hint how much more burden or regulation has come in. Then there is a new topic called clinical evaluation. It has already started before the so-called MDR, medical device regulation. But it is a new topic, and a lot of people have a little bit of pain how to use that in a positive way, or how to use it in a good way and not only to feel it as a burden. Why is the clinical evaluation needed? We need that because we need to do what is called a benefit risk determination for each medical product. So you have to show that the benefit risk ratio for a medical product is positive before you go into the market. Otherwise said, we have more and more so-called non-adding value but necessary processes. This is coming from lean management, which has 3 categories of processes, so-called adding value processes, which are the ones we want to have. Then the non-adding value but necessary processes, so means you need to do them, but they're not really giving an added value to the product. And everything else which is called waste, which you should kind of leave and be aware that you have them, but try to reduce them as much as possible. So this middle orange category has become bigger and bigger in the medtech market. Then the pain of the medtech industry in the last 10, 15 years, unfortunately, has not been heard. In contrary, research is getting more and more money to push innovation. And please be aware, innovation is not the same as invention. What in research is done, you get money to create inventions. The invention then is taken by the industry, put into the society or the market to generate revenues. And once such an invention is in the market, then it's actually called an innovation. So the research units are getting the money from the state at the moment. This means as well that the research units are generating a lot of results. This is actually good. On the other hand, or moreover, we have the digitalization, which is not really an evolution. It seems to become more and more a revolution. And this creates more and more requirements to be fulfilled. We will see them afterwards. And you need more people with an adequate knowledge and know-how. So having a lot of specialists, each in being very good in his specific domain is a good thing to have. But people which have the overview and can connect those dots together are missing. And machine learning as well, artificial intelligence is part of this big wave that started somewhere 5, 10, 15 years ago. So let's start on the regulatory side with the definition. Switzerland and the EU have in their regulation definitions what actually a medical device is. So should your device do anything that goes into these definitions, then by law, the device becomes a medical product, which has to follow those rules. So this is already the first step, which is called qualification of the product as a medical device. So does the device qualify as a medical product or not? I'm not going to read all those details. I just want to give you the definition such that you know there is a definition and it can be looked up afterwards. Then other definitions which are quite interesting is what is making available on the market actually meant by the regulators. It means any supply of a device other than an investigational device for distribution, consumption, and use on the union market in the course of a commercial activity. And now the important part comes, whether in return of payment or free of charge. So the question is now, is a device which is produced or designed within a university hospital, for example, within a research project, an investigational device? Or does it become a commercial device? Because if you give that device to another person, which then makes a diagnosis on a patient, that actually falls into a commercial activity. Even if you give the device for free to your colleague, you do what is called making available on the market. There is a big gray zone that we have a lot of discussions. I just want to mention here the definition is like that. The interpretation is another topic. Other things like placing on the market, putting into service are additional definitions. What is interesting here is to say, what is a clinical investigation? Because the device, investigational device, is then an investigational device when it is within a clinical investigation. The MDR, that regulation from the EU, actually has an own definition. It means a systematic investigation involved one or more human subjects undertaking to assess the safety or performance of the device. So should you do one of those two things, you will become directly a clinical investigation as seen by this regulation. And even the investigational device is then defined, as already said, it is a device that is assessed within a clinical investigation. You find all those things in that big document, which is called Medical Device Regulation. You can remember this number 6745 and EU, and you can find the whole document on the public side of the EU. Now, why is this all important? what you have to do, should you fall into that, you then have to show that your device is conform. So you have to make a declaration of conformity, which is this CE mark that you often see on devices. That is the same process for those devices as for medical products. So the European Union and Switzerland do not know a process of accreditation, like, for example, the US with the FDA, that is deciding that the product is allowed to go on the market or not. You can place the product on the market, and in parallel, you have to show that you have conformity, which is a primarily self-declaration. It can be controlled by a notified body. So it's not that you have to go there and you give an okay, thumb up or down. It is you place the device on the market and you have to have the conformity declaration in parallel ready. Should something happen and you are controlled, then they want to see those documents. This is like that true for so-called low-risk products. For high-risk products, the process is a little bit different. You have, in addition, a so-called notified body, which is going to control or double check your technical documentation. To that point, we will come back later on. So this is a little bit the environment. The same is actually true for Switzerland. I'm giving here you the laws, the Verordnung, Medizinprodukteverordnung. But if you read those texts, you see those texts are almost 90 to 100% equivalent to what the EU does at the moment. So it means Switzerland is taking over unidirectly the laws of the European Union within the territory of Switzerland. The same is true for the definitions. So what I just have shown beforehand is just translated into German and then put on the law. So having said that, we know now that the MDR, that document, EU MDR, is a very important document. And there is an Annex 1, which actually summarizes what you have to do. That chapter is called General Safety and Performance Requirements, or GSPR. So should you hear that GSPR, this means that this is the summary of general safety and performance requirements. Such a medical device, should it be qualified as a medical device, has to follow. And one of the interesting things is that you have to show safety, effectivity. You have to show the safety on the patient, on the health, on the user, and on where applicable on other persons. So everybody which is involved in the product has to be safe. Then you have to show that the product within its intended purpose has a positive performance. And that performance actually is assessed by the so-called benefit-risk ratio. We will come back to that later on. So these are kind of the first two of a lot of paragraphs that you will find it as Annex 1. And the other ones should be applied as well. I do not have the time here to go into the details, but for an overfly activity, that is far enough. So next point. Once we know that, we will see that in this Annex 1, there is a requirement for quality management system. That actually can be fulfilled by having a quality management system which is certified. So you go to a notified body through a certification process through that standard here. And if you get the certificate as a company, then you are okay. This is not only true for companies, that is actually for everybody which has the function of that legal manufacturer. Just to be reminded, you can become very fastly a legal manufacturer with those definitions I just have shown. Another point is that you have to have a risk management system. That actually can be shown by having shown the conformity to that norm here, standard that I'm showing you here. So I do not want to go more in those details because we want to focus on AI. So let's focus on the R&D process within this medical device regulation, or a little bit more abstract. What do we have? We have a product idea. So often an idea becomes an invention that has to be transferred in requirements. Now we have two things that we want to address. We want to have a producible product and a testable product, as well as a saleable product. You will now tell me, what is that here? that means that you are allowed to sell the product, or that you are allowed to put the product on the market, even if you are not asking for money. So the first part, from the product idea through the requirements to a producible, testable product, is primarily an engineering task, and that is for a lot of people very understandable and very easy to follow. It's just a documentation part. On the other thing, you have to have those requirements and have a saleable product, which means you have to follow the regulation. And that means nowadays that you have to have a technical documentation. So TD stands for technical documentations. There starts the problem, to say so, or the issue. There are a lot of requirements coming from that regulatory side, and that have to be documented in that technical documentation. For example, you have to show a clinical evaluation for that benefit risk ratio I just mentioned. You have to show the quality management system, how it is addressed, risk management system, and. But what is more interesting is the requirements for an algorithm. An algorithm has to be transparent, interpretable, explainable, repeatable, reliable, and efficient in its results. And you can already see that here the big issue comes for AI, because transparency and interpretability and explainability is not that easy in machine learning and AI as it is in so-called classic algorithms. Let's go back and see what are then the requirements for a technical documentation. And this is something you should do even in a clinical investigation, which has not the focus to go for a medical product, because you risk to do the clinical study twice. So to prevent that, you do, as you would develop a product, you do a general description of the device. You don't need the trade name, but the general description, including what it is intended purpose and it is intended user. Then a basic UDI you don't need as long as you're not a legal manufacturer. Then you need to do intended patient population, medical conditions to be diagnosed, treated, and/or monitored or considered as such a patient selection criteria, indications, contraindications, and warnings. So those people working in clinical studies will say, oh, we know all that already. So please have that ready and summarize that in a good document from beginning, and do not change it, because the change of that will change the environment for the product, as we will see in a minute. Then you have to do a rationale for the qualification of the product as a device. Means if your medical device is actually a medical device according to those regulations. And following that, you do what is so-called risk classification of the device. There is an Annex 8, which has rules to show you what kind of risk class then your device becomes. So to sum up, you want to have from the beginning, so meaning when you do the first step in the innovation already, a general description of the product, including the intended purpose, the intended user, the intended patient population, and the medical conditions. You want to know from the beginning if that device could become a medical product under the regulation or not, and if it is, what kind of risk class it is, because as higher the risk class is, as more requirements you have to fulfill. If you don't do that from the beginning, you risk to go back, like in a Leiterli-Spiel in German, where you are working and you go back to zero and then you have to restart again. People which are doing that from the beginning have much less work. So actually it's an investment to have less work afterwards. Now let's focus a little bit on the benefit risk ratio, because that's something we want to see, we want actually to show with algorithms using machine learning or artificial intelligence. So clinical evidence means clinical data and a clinical evaluation resulting penetrating to a device of a sufficient amount and quality to allow a qualified assessment of whether the device is safe and achieves the intended clinical benefit. So the safety is something that a company can do. The intended clinical benefit is something you should do already on the academic level, because if that changes, that will mean that things are going to change as well. Both points will be important when you are part of a startup or spin-off within an academia. Clinical performance and clinical benefit actually are defined as well. Let's just have a look at the clinical benefit. It is the positive impact of the device. So that's actually what we as engineers want to show. So this was not there in the MDD in that kind of dominance as it is nowadays. From that, now the questions arise. How do we measure the clinical benefit in machine learning on AI? How do we measure the risk respectively? How reduce the risk of such a device using AI? And what is the clinical evaluation in the ML/MI medical product required? Often a clinical study. So this means when we do a clinical evaluation, we often will have to do a clinical study to show that. We know that clinical studies are costly, and you do not want to do that twice. We see that too much, that in academia, a clinical study is done, how MDs, so medical doctors, see that, and then the regulators are coming and saying, sorry, this is not fulfilling the requirements of the MDR, that's why you have to redo the whole study. Something that you want to prevent. So let's focus now more on AI. What kind of types do we have? Very generally, we have so-called supervised learning, we have unsupervised learning, and reinforced learning. Supervised learning uses labeled data. In medicine, that would say we have a so-called golden standard diagnosis that is available and that we can use for the training. In unsupervised training, learning, we don't have that. And actually, this is in medical environment, in my opinion, only useful for feature extraction or generation of new diagnosis, findings for new patterns and diagnosis, as we have done that in the Department of Cardiology in Basel. So I actually was 7 years there, working as a postdoc in parallel to my industry career. So unsupervised learning can be very helpful for finding features and then generating hypotheses. Reinforced learning, I would say, is not that much of topic. It is coming from the gaming industry. It is very well known there, but in medical environment, I do not see much of that. Now the question is, we will have to do a technical documentation. This means we have to document our deep neural network, for example, and you have to make that in a way that it is transparent and explainable. So show me a flow chart of a deep NN, such in a way as you do a flow chart for temperature detection. If the temperature is high, you have fiber. If the temperature is low, at that threshold, you don't have any fiber. So you see, it's this kind of if-else thoughts that we do not have in the deep neural networks. We cannot show that in details. We cannot show how all those parameters, all those found hyperparameters actually work in combination and how they do have an influence on the final result. Fortunately, we have ETHZ working with a group on that, and I'm really looking forward for their results, how we can make a neural network more transparent and explainable. That would help for the documentation. The notified body, for example, which would review your document, is looking for something like that. So means that should you work with an industry and you are the expert in neural networks, you have already to think about how to explain him how the algorithm part of that neural network is working. On the other hand, we have the clinical environment, just as a small reminder. We have so-called experimental studies, observational studies, then the randomized control trial, non-randomized control trial, cohort studies, case control studies, and cross-sectional studies where data is generated from. Why do I mention that? Because garbage in, garbage out. This means we know that there are different types of clinical studies being done. And the data which is generated from that is our source, to say so, to then train the neural network or the artificial intelligence. The problem here is that you might have a clinical bias. You might have co-founding already in the data because of the study type. For example, causality cannot be shown by a cohort study. It has to be done, it has to be shown by a control trial. Then not all control trials are randomized. If they are not, they suffer from bias, selection bias. So I'm not saying one is good or the other is bad, or you should use that. Just be aware of what you're using and what are the advantages and disadvantages of the data of what type of study they have taken from. So, and the other thing is, take the appropriated statistics. It does not make sense to use odds ratio in a randomized control trial, but it makes a lot of sense to use that in a case control study. So there are specific statistics for specific types of clinical studies, and you are doing very good in having that. And that's why in the title, I have this thing of saying you need what is nowadays called a data scientist. Meaning he is looking at the data, telling you what quality of the data is there, what type of the quality is there, what are the statistical behaviors or characteristics, because that has direct influence on how the machine learning or the neural network AI is then performing. So do not just take a data set from the net, for example, and work on it and then come and show how well you are, because in regulation, that is not sufficient. It is great to have a paper published somewhere in a scientific journal, but for regulators, that's not satisfactory. That's the first step of a whole chain. The other thing is the whole discussion about freezed algorithm. So when you have, for example, supervised learning, so you have your training set, you have your test set, you have your machine learner and the predictive model and the statistics. You have to know first, what do you do with that? Because what we have at the moment as an interpretation from the regulatory side is that you have to freeze your algorithm. So the prediction model should be freezed as long as it is used in the clinical environment. Are you going to change something in the machine learner part, so in your development system, and you transfer that to a productive system? So you hear already that there is a separation needed between two systems. As soon as you transfer from the development system to the productive system, you generate a new version. That is nothing new. We have done that already 20, 30 years beforehand, before today. So when you generate a new algorithm, you have a new version, but then you have to do the testing from 0 to 100% again. So if you have that automized, good for you. If not, then less good. But the must is you have to retest everything. So should you have an algorithm which is learning in the real environment, you actually should, anytime there is a learning cycle, retest the whole algorithm, which is not, how to say, it's possible theoretically, but it's not applicable. That's one of the problems. So do a separation to a productive system from the development version and do a freezing on the prediction part. That's why I like this kind of pictures for supervised learning more than others which are in the market, to say so. And the other thing I have already said, you have to think about how do you make, for example, your deep neural network transparent, interpretable, and explainable, and how do you make those results repeatable, reliable, and the algorithm efficient? You see already those parts which are in red are the red dots. The one which we have very well under control is the efficiency. That we can show very easily. So let's go to that part as well. Probably the best thing to do nowadays is that you go in so-called semi-supervised learning. So you do not supervised and non-supervised learning, you do something which can be called semi-supervised learning. What do I mean with that? Some parts of the labels are available for training, and part of the GSD is blind, which is in signal processing, old school, I know, meant training set, test set. So you have a training set where you have the labels available and open for the algorithm, and you have a test set where you have the labels, so the gold standard, available but blind for the algorithm, which is then in clinical environment called the derivation set. In machine learning, artificial intelligence, we are using same labels for different things. We have a training set, we have a cross-validation set, and a test set. But here, the labels are available. So this means the labels are available and non-blind. So what can we do now? We take that part away and say, we have here what is called a validation set. The validation set will be the set which is blind, meaning we make this test set here open, as in machine learning, and we make this set here validation set, attention, not cross-validation set, validation set. That validation set, a set which is with gold standard diagnosis available, but blind for the algorithm design. And that actually is how you do it in a clinical study as well. So you have the medical doctor, which is blind to certain results, which is then called a blind trial. So you use that technology actually to do the same in artificial intelligence. So this means that weak supervision that we become actually becomes a strong argument in a positive sense. Now we can go even further. So you have an ongoing study, for example. How do you do it now? So you have a derivation set, which you separate in a training set, test set, or training cross-validation test set. Then you have a validation set where the gold standard is blind in the first part. But when you have new patients coming in, you make a separation and say, now that validation set becomes, including the derivation set, my new derivation set, and then I have a new validation set. So what you hear from here is you have to have a so-called clinical study strategy, how you handle the data. And again, this is something that a data scientist can do very well. They are now trained for something like that. They know those advantages and disadvantages. I do not want to go more in detail to it. I think that's already enough from this side. So my take-home messages for today would be aware if what you do is actually qualified as a medical product or not. Then have in mind that the quality management system and the regular risk management is needed according to norms, standards. So you cannot just take the quality management system from the hospital. It has to be a 13485. Then freeze your algorithm on the productive system. At the moment, that's the state of the art. How that will look like in 5-10 years, we do not know. Then your technical documentation has to prove transparency, interpretability, and explainability, readability, reliability, and efficiency when you are the legal manufacturer. But you can do that already at an earlier stage. And then those for the last 3 points, data is key. Again, data is key. And last but not least, data is key. Thank you very much.